The studio was quiet except for the soft buzz of equipment and the occasional murmur of the production crew. Amelia Hartley stood in front of the camera, bathed in golden lighting that had been adjusted for over an hour to give her just the right
glow.
She was dressed in a muted rose silk dress that matched the brand palette, her posture composed, her expression soft but deliberate. This was the moment she had been preparing for over 6 months, the final cut of the launch video for As Ever Rosé, a lifestyle brand that was meant to redefine her public image. Behind the monitor in a corner of the room, Julian watched silently. He had arrived early with their son Theo, hoping the boy might get to see his mother in action, but a crew member had politely redirected them to the back room. Julian didn't mind. He understood boundaries. He cradled Theo in his lap, letting the child snack on fruit slices while Amelia's voice played on the speakers. The script had been rehearsed many times. He knew it by heart. There was a moment in the second half of the video where she was supposed to speak about the strength she drew from her family, particularly the support system that had carried her through transitions. She had told him 2 nights earlier that she wanted to mention him and Theo briefly, nothing extravagant, just honest. But when the cameras rolled, the moment came and went without the mention. Instead, Amelia improvised. She spoke about self-sufficiency, about walking away from expectations, about being reborn in solitude. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly as the speech flowed smoothly, free of any hesitation. Her words were powerful, clearly rehearsed, too polished to be accidental. He didn't react outwardly. He simply shifted Theo to his other knee and looked at the screen with a stillness that was almost unnatural. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. But something inside him, the part of him that had held on to the shared vision of this launch, as a couple, as a family, was going very quiet. After the final take, Amelia stepped out of the frame to applause from her team. She smiled and accepted compliments, laughing with the stylists and giving a small hug to her branding consultant. Julian waited for her to glance his way. She didn't. She moved past him as if he were another crew member, only pausing to give Theo a soft pat on the head. Then she disappeared into a room with her publicist. On the drive home, Julian kept the windows half down. Theo had fallen asleep in his car seat, his fingers still sticky from strawberries. Julian glanced at the boy, then back at the road, and then he quietly turned the radio on, not for music but just to fill the silence that had started growing. Somewhere in the back of his chest. The next morning, Julian sat at the kitchen table long before sunrise, stirring a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He had barely slept. The video played again in his mind, not because he wanted it to, but because his thoughts had nowhere else to land. The absence of his name, of Theo's, had not been a mistake. The delivery had been too smooth, the pacing too rehearsed. He knew Amelia. He had lived inside her rhythms long enough to recognize intention when he saw it. Still, a small part of him wanted to believe there had been a last-minute change, that she'd felt nervous or maybe pressured by her team. Instead of confrontation, he chose restraint. He picked up his phone and typed a short message carefully, without weight or accusation, just a soft reminder that they had noticed. He placed the phone down after sending it and listened for the buzz that never came. By noon, the British tabloids had clipped the segment. Amelia's face was everywhere, framed in headlines calling her empowered, independent, triumphant. The comments beneath the clips were glowing. Women applauded her poise. Bloggers dissected her symbolism. But back in London, in the ancestral estate of Julian's family, the response was quieter and far less forgiving. His brother Edward, always composed but deeply attuned to subtle affronts, had watched the video during his break between official duties. He sat alone in his study, fingers clasped in front of him, eyes unblinking as Amelia spoke of resilience while omitting the very people who had been her refuge. Later that evening, He joined a secure call with their father, and Julian. Julian appeared on screen, eyes tired, his background dim. He didn't launch into any explanation. He simply nodded when Edward asked if the omission had been planned. Then he leaned back and rested his forehead against his hand. Their father listened in silence, then turned to Edward and asked what should be done. There was no public response plan, nothing official, but behind closed doors, the mood shifted. Edward instructed the palace media office to monitor Amelia's next appearances. He flagged the video as a message, one not just personal, but political. It wasn't about wine or branding anymore. It was about division. And if she was beginning to separate her narrative from the family's completely, they needed to prepare. Meanwhile, Julian stayed in California, unsure whether to raise the matter with Amelia or wait for her to bring it up. But each day passed without acknowledgement. Amelia moved through their shared home like a guest. She responded to emails at hours, left for meetings before sunrise, and when she did speak, her words were brief and efficient, like someone managing a schedule, not a marriage. One evening, as Julian was folding Theo's pajamas, the boy asked whether they'd all be in the next video together. Julian paused, then told him maybe next time. Then he sat on the floor beside his son's bed, listening to the sound of small breaths falling into sleep, while wondering if next time would ever come. Days turned into a week, and the silence between Julian and Amelia thickened into something that no longer felt temporary. They shared the same house, the same hallway, the same kitchen counter every morning, but not the same rhythm. Julian had begun waking earlier, often slipping out with Theo while the sun was still low on the horizon. He would pack a small breakfast, strap the child into the car, and drive aimlessly down the Pacific Coast Highway until they found a quiet patch of sand. There, he let Theo run, dig, and laugh while he sat nearby, watching the waves roll in without speaking a word. Inside the house, Amelia had carved out her own world. Her office was transformed into a command center, whiteboards filled with launch timelines, scent samples, label proofs, and social media mock-ups. Nicolette, her branding consultant, had practically moved in. The two women would sit cross-legged on the floor late into the night, sipping herbal tea, dissecting Amelia's public image. Nicolette often reminded her how important clarity was, how a diluted message could confuse the consumer. Amelia nodded every time. She didn't argue. She just absorbed. At first, she had told herself that the omission of Julian and Theo wasn't personal, it was strategic. She had reasoned that her audience needed to see her standing alone, unlinked to past narratives that had defined her, too often through other people. But something in her chest fluttered with unease when she replayed the footage. She tried to ignore it, pushing the feeling down under layers of rationale and branding logic. One night, long after Nicolette had gone and the house had gone still, Amelia sat at the kitchen counter scrolling through old videos on her phone. In one clip, Theo was in Bordeaux, laughing as he ran through a row of vines, Julian chasing behind him, both of them flushed with sun and joy. Amelia watched the video 3 times. Then she turned the phone face down. Across the hall, Julian stood by the doorway to Theo's room. He didn't go inside. Instead, he leaned against the wall, listening to his son's quiet breaths and the faint sound of a lullaby playing on repeat. He had thought many times about confronting Amelia, directly asking her why, demanding some kind of explanation. But each time, something held him back. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter. A sense that the answer had already been given, and speaking it aloud would only confirm what he was hoping wasn't true. The days continued like that. Julian became quieter, not out of anger but out of resignation. He started answering messages from his brother Edward more promptly. He even began casually looking at rental properties in Sussex, nothing serious, just options. Amelia, meanwhile, drifted further into the polished world she had created, one filled with curated aesthetics and well-controlled narratives. She told herself it was working. The metrics said so. The followers were growing. The media was enchanted. But at night, when she looked at the empty side of the bed, her chest felt strangely hollow. Neither of them said the words out loud, but both had begun to understand that something had broken, not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, over time, in the spaces where their names should have been spoken. 2 weeks after the video's release, Amelia arrived at the streaming studio for her first major sit-down interview. The set was tastefully minimal, soft lighting, beige tones, glass of rose placed perfectly beside her chair. Everything had been styled to match the Iris Rose brand. She wore a pale mauve dress, her hair in a loose wave, her expression carefully measured. As the cameras rolled, she leaned forward slightly, as instructed, and spoke in the soft, sincere voice her team had trained with her for days. When the interviewer brought up the subject of balanced career, motherhood, marriage, Amelia hesitated. For a second, just long enough to be noticed. Then she smiled, crossed her legs, and spoke about rediscovery, about how important it was to return to oneself. She said some seasons required solitude, and that sometimes the truest expression of self meant making difficult edits to the story you tell the world. Julian watched the interview from the living room, the screen casting a faint glow across his tired face. He had known she wouldn't mention them again, but it still stung to see it all dressed so elegantly.